Alright, well, welcome to my brief legacy set review, and I'm sorry for potential audio issues. I'm trying to figure all that out on my end. There's a little bit of distortion, and I'm not sure if it's because of my mic setup or how I'm encoding it or recording it or whatever, but I gotta figure that out. We've got some cards from Strixhaven that are interesting in terms of their application and legacy, though not necessarily as obviously powerful as, say, something like Uro or Oko was. But I do think it opens up some deck building decisions that we didn't really have before, despite not being overtly powerful. Now, the first one we're going to start with is not actually from Strixhaven. It's from the Modern Horizons 2, but it's in the, I believe it's called the Mythic Archive or Mystical Archive or whatever that alternate art um, set of Strixhaven is. They included this as a sneak peek of a future set, which doesn't make it legacy legal when Strixhaven becomes legal. So that card here is Abundant Harvest. Now, with a card like this, typically it's pretty weak for a lot of the decks currently existing in Legacy. They can just play better card selection options. But I think it's important to realize that a draw spell like this gets better when you don't really care what specific non-land you draw, just that you want to draw a non-land, or you just want like a density of lands. So obviously red-green lands is a deck that doesn't really care that much what specific lands it draws all the time. And it doesn't really care a lot of times what specific non-lands you draw, because you kind of just want like a mix of them. And maybe Abundant Harvest is justifiable in some number as a way to kind of improve the consistency of early game opening hands. It in many ways, it's just kind of going to be a redraw, but this might be a deck where it's a little bit more justifiable. Any slightly increased percent chance of having access to a sideboard card like, say, Choke or Sphere of Resistance is maybe something that's worth it, and currently Red-Green Lands doesn't really have a way to slightly increase those chances. Um, and typically you don't really play very many lands in the sideboard, if at all, anymore, so you can't really kind of gimmick it a little bit by boarding out some extra non-lands that are kind of weak in the matchup to kind of improve your chances, but I don't really think you necessarily need to. If you're, say, trying to get a piece of Graveyard Hate or Caracas, Abundant Harvest actually has a reasonable chance to do that for you, since it can always grab like Life from the Loam or Crop Rotation, which is a way to help dig for them. So in lands specifically, I think it's suited to potentially be playable, but I'm not really sure I would cut any of the non-lands for it. And there's certainly not too many actual lands you can cut, so I'm not sure how you would be able to make this card work in lands. But that was just with the first deck that came to mind with how it could be playable. Um, like maybe there's a world in which you use it kind of similarly to Land Grant for some kinds of combo decks. Um, I know Charbelcher typically uses Land Grant as a way to find its land, but that's actually mana positive because you play Land Grant for 0. But if you're playing if you're playing a deck that maybe wants more than one land, but like less than 5, less than 6, which I know is a very narrow criteria, maybe you end up playing some number of Abundant Harvest because you don't necessarily need the mana now, but guaranteeing it next turn is maybe something that's valuable. Um, but I'm not really sure what kind of deck would be interested in that. But it's a unique effect, so I'd be interested to see if other people can figure it out more. Um, but that was just kind of the first thing that came to mind. So the next one up, I don't actually have a deck list prepared as a slide for this. I have I can switch here. But this is a card that is getting a ton of hype, particularly for Modern, but I think it's potentially for Legacy as well. Now, typically, we don't see too many Monastery Swiftspear type decks really dominating, but we have seen Swiftspear be playable in Delver decks before, and I think Lumimancer is another option for them. So maybe it gives you enough reason to potentially go back to something like Jeskai Delver or You could just straight up play blue-white, I guess, and maybe you end up like leaning a little bit heavier on like a slower Delver game in the way that some of the Geist of St. Traff Delvers did years ago. But I think one of the important takeaways with Clever Lumimancer is that unlike Swift Spear, it doesn't actually present a clock on its own. You actually have to be casting spells to do it. So with just one spell, it's actually comparable to Monastery Swift Spear. So there's not really a reason to play this over Swift Spear if you're only planning on casting one spell. But you can do some cool little tricks with it, particularly in Modern, where you play like some storm cards like Grape Shot or Ground Rift because this triggers off of copying. So you can do some cool little things with Flusterstorm and Legacy potentially. So I could even see maybe a Nivmagus Clever Lumimancer deck being tried out for a little bit, but I think one of the key things to look at is potentially Surgical plus Daze plus Flusterstorm as like a reasonable interaction to just get more cheap spells or something like Gut Shot. Um, Particularly Daze because like it's reasonable that they'll be playing a removal spell on your turn, but I do think it's important when you're deck building in Legacy that you can't rely on Daze as being a way to pump up this card unless you're dazing your own spell. But you know, at that point, it can be a little bit riskier. But so I don't think it has quite as much potential in Legacy as it does in Modern because Legacy decks typically aren't looking for more copies of Monastery Swiftspear, but it being in another color and actually working with cards like Flusterstorm maybe makes it interesting in terms of deck building space. So maybe you end up main decking a couple more Flusterstorms, which is like the card's totally reasonable on its own anyway. Like it's a good sideboard card. So I can imagine you lean a little bit more on cards like Flusterstorm as your counter magic, and rely on more proactive spells. Maybe you go back to playing some number of mutagenic growths in Delver decks or gut shots. But I'm not super uh, I'm not super satisfied by that. I think in terms of deck building, those cards are pretty weak on their own. Um, but that is like an avenue you could take. Uh, Ground Rift is like another avenue you could play, like Nivmagus Delver, I suppose. Nivmagus with Clever Lumimancer, and use Ground Rift, and then basically with Nivmagus you just exile the copies. Same with Flusterstorm, so you actually have more ways to just kill your opponent pretty quickly, and then it starts to look a little bit like the Modern Shell, but then you can end up playing maybe like Daze and Force of Will as ways to actually protect your threats better. So I think the card has like a good amount of potential, and I could even see like Burn potentially playing it. I know in Legacy they tend to be far more mono red than they do in other formats, but maybe there's some merit to this in those decks. Um, I think so. I'm gonna put a note here. Yeah, so I'm just gonna put it like this. It's gonna be like a little bit of notes. I'm just doing this in like one take effectively live. So we're gonna see, although I am re-recording this. I had recorded a version that didn't include any cards from the commander decks. Um, but looking, upon thinking about it further, I think it just made sense to wait until the commander decks were fully spoiled, because sometimes we get some legacy playables in there, and it turns out we got a couple that I think I'm gonna end up discussing. So I think it was worth the reshot. So um, yeah, so this is another card that I don't think fits in a slam dunk into any of the decks that I have prepared. But one of the ones I was thinking was maybe you play this elite spellbinder in like some version of D&T because it's like nice to flicker it. It does increase your threes that you can't tutor off of Recruiter of the Guard though, which is relevant, but it is a pretty powerful effect. You could also, I guess, include it in like Maverick decks. You could include it in potentially like Miracles. I guess you could play it in some of the Miracle sideboards, though. I mean, Vendilion Click is typically better. Um, and I'm a much bigger fan of that, and even that's on the decline in terms of playability. But Spellbinder is a card that I think has far more applications in Modern or Pioneer than it does in Legacy. But typically these cards are still like pretty reasonable. It being a human is actually super relevant because it works pretty well with Meddling Mage. So you can use like Meddling Mage to block them from naming a card, and then you can use Spellbinder to block them from naming the next card that they have in hand. You can also pair it with cards like Reflector Mage as well, or Brazen Borrower. So maybe it's a little bit of a boost to Legacy Humans, which already has seen some success over the last couple of years. And Spellbinder is a pretty big upgrade to that deck because you get to actually have an evasive flyer or an evasive beater now, in addition to Kitesail Freebooter, that actually gets to disrupt the opponent. And that's the most important thing when you're playing a lot of these creature decks in Legacy. You just want to make sure that your creatures are paired with some form of disruption. They don't need to necessarily be like silver bullets for a lot of matchups, but they need to have some way to slow down your opponent's game plan or otherwise disrupt them. And you kind of just chain those enough turns in a row, and it's usually enough to end up burying the opponent. And Spellbinder is a creature that does that pretty effectively. Making something cost 2 more is a pretty significant premium in Legacy, though 3 mana to get a creature that generates that effect is also, somewhat expensive. But the creature decks are more able to justify playing cards like Noble Hierarch on turn 1, and that makes it a lot more appealing. So, maybe playing Noble Hierarch into this and then attacking for 4 while also disrupting your opponent is good enough for a lot of decks. But we also tend to see more 1 and 2 ups. And one of the things with Elite Spellbinders, it kind of gets worse in multiples because typically you've taken their best card with it, and because it costs so much mana, you don't necessarily want to draw the second copy because a lot of times it may not actually hit much, and you can't hit the card that you've just hit again because it gets exiled. So it is a little bit awkward in multiples, but there are cards in the humans decks that can take advantage of that. Meddling Mage, Kitesail Freebooter into this is like a good way to just shut down people entirely. You could even like Phantasmal Image or Charming Prince this to end up resetting it later in the game as well, which is something you can't do. You can clone Kitesail Freebooter, but you can't use Charming Prince to grab 2 cards off Kitesail Freebooter, but you can with Elite Spellbinder, and that may be an avenue for those decks to explore. And it becomes a little more appealing with Ether Vial for what it's worth because you can nab it in their draw step, and they may still be able to cast the card, but if they're paying 3 for their Lightning Bolt or 3 for their Ponder, that may be their whole turn. And when you pair that with either Rishadan Ports or Wastelands or Thalias, this disruption kind of gets this cumulative nature to it. So while I don't think this card is like a slam dunk for any particular Legacy deck, I think it opens up a unique form of disruption that we haven't really seen on a competitive racing body like this before. So it's something I think D&T may explore a little bit more than other decks, but I'm expecting humans to play it, even though that's a very fringe deck. The next card we have here is Professor of Symbology, which isn't a particularly interesting card in Legacy. It doesn't really do a whole lot. But one of the main reasons I wanted to talk about this is because it's probably the most playable learn effect that we've seen in Strixhaven for Legacy, and it kind of gives decks like D&T and stuff like that access to a 2-mana 2/1 that can grab like a real card from the sideboard. Now the lessons aren't super strong, but there's one that like it's like 5 mana exile and non-land permanent. There's one that draws a card and stuff like that. So there are definitely things you can do with this. There's a naturalize that you can grab as well. And there's like a divination you can grab depending on what color combination you are. But I think the most powerful one for Legacy, I believe, is the next. Yeah, so I paired the two together. Is this one, Academic Probation? This is the main reason why Professor of Symbology makes the list. Is because similarly to Spellbinder, you can have a creature that ends up having a disruptive effect even for maybe just 1 or 2 more turns. And not having silence type effects can be really powerful in Legacy, particularly in the combo matchups, but it's difficult to justify a main deck slot because they put you down a card when they do it. So if it doesn't actively win you the game, it oftentimes makes it harder for you to win because it required you to hold up so much mana. In a lot of ways, Academic Probation has that same issue, right? It requires you to spend 2 mana, which can be a lot, in order to prevent your opponent from playing only a specific card that you've named or activating a specific permanent that you've named. But where I think that this may be playable is in a deck like D&T, where you actually have a lot of this cumulative disruption, and many times there's only 1 or 2 cards you care about your opponent playing anyway. You and in that sense, you can kind of have a mono white meddling mage for like 1 or 2 turns, but depending on how many Professor of Symbologies you play, you could potentially have more. If you blink it with Flicker Wisp or Charming Prince in some decks or some other avenue to that. This is also something that's not necessarily dead in other matchups either. You can always just target a Merit Lage token and it can't attack, right? On that turn, and it gives you an extra turn. Now, obviously, if they're making it on end step, you don't have that option. But there even something like a Jace the Mind Sculptor or a Delver that suddenly can't attack on the turn. It has the ability to swing even creature matchups in some fringe instances. So I think if you approach it from the perspective of a temporary meddling mage in mono white, it becomes potentially playable in D&T. But I think the biggest issue for Death and Taxes is not necessarily what cards do we play, but what cards do we cut, because there's a lot of cards that these decks have played before that they don't play now. And there's a lot more options now than there ever have been before. Plus, it takes up sideboard slots. So while you're not actually spending a whole card in order to get that type of silence effect for 1 turn, you are spending a sideboard slot. And, I'm not sure if that's something that ends up being relevant. So, because typically you spend some amount of your sideboard slots on anti-combo or, ways to beat something like a board wipe. And maybe you don't have to sideboard cards you would ordinarily do to that if you play the Professor of Symbology Academic Probation package. In addition, if it's a matchup where you don't really need to tap anything down for a turn, or you don't need to silence for 1 turn, I guess you can just rummage through your deck, churn a little bit, which isn't necessarily bad. But I think D&T is also one of those decks that is a little bit more well suited to play this package of cards together, simply because they have access to Ether Vial. So Ether Vialing Professor Symbology and allows you to then spend mana on your turn, not developing your board, because you kind of got to do that for free. So maybe there's games in which Rashad Import isn't enough and you would much rather do this. I don't know, but I think it's something that is borderline playable, and I think it's almost entirely because of Academic Probation. Although if you're playing something like Maverick and for whatever reason you're playing this, you could grab a Naturalize out of your sideboard as well. So it ends up occupying a really unique space, I think, in terms of deck building decisions for Legacy, in the fact that my 1-turn meddling mage could also in some matchups be a Knight of Autumn. So because you can also grab a life gain one off of this. You can grab a really expensive removal spell. You can grab, I think there's one that lets you kill planeswalkers or return one of your own planeswalkers, stuff like that. So depending on what specific color combination you're playing. So this aggro is maybe not the appropriate term. Maybe like D&T. Maybe Dead Guy Ale plays some combination of this, but I feel like they'd rather want something like Elite Spellbinder. Yeah, so the next one up after that is Strict Proctor, which, shocker, is another potentially D&T card. Now, it is important to keep in mind that this does kind of shut off some of your own effects, for example, Recruiter or Flicker Wisp, but it kind of breaks the symmetrical nature of something like a Tocatli Honor Guard, because we've been able to play cards like this before in D&T, and we typically choose not to. But flying is obviously a huge upgrade over something that doesn't have flying. But being able to pay 2 for your own enters the battlefield trigger actually comes up in D&T when you are Ether Vialing in something like a Flicker Wisp, and oftentimes you don't have to spend your own mana on the cards that you're playing. And I think that's actually a pretty big factor for a card like this. Now, it's obviously a huge drawback against some decks, and while it is good against something like Icefang Quaddle or Snapcaster Mage, it's pretty awkward against Uro. Yeah, they don't get to draw the card and gain the life, but they do just get to keep their 6/6 that they play for 3. And that can be something that's a little risky, but in a deck like D&T, maybe you don't care that much because you have Caracas, you've got Swords to Plowshares, you've got Skyclave Apparitions that you are kind of well suited to actually deal with the 6/6 body of Uro. So maybe just shutting off the actual value they always get from it might be something that's worth it. I'm not really sure. Now, uh, the other thing is, the opponent later in the game will have the option to pay the 2 sometimes, but D&T is a deck that is exceptionally good at constricting its opponent's mana, and even something like Elite Spellbinder, like Strict Proctor into Elite Spellbinder is also like even more disruption options than we've had before, and they both tax in this like paying 2 kind of way, um, which I think is a lot more powerful than it really seems. So Strict Proctor is a card that is really it's more like a one-sided Tocatli Honor Guard than I think we've really ever seen before, especially because D&T doesn't actually play a huge amount of enters compared to prior formats. Now, you've got Recruiter and Flicker Wisp and Skyclave Apparition and Stoneforge Mystic, but generally speaking, you can afford to pay the enters the battlefield effect for something like Stoneforge Mystic in a lot of games. But I think giving creature decks more disruption that's justifiable to play, and giving unique ways to kind of break the symmetry of these kinds of hate bears, I think is really cool. And I'm really glad they went with that design choice over just printing a cookie cutter Torpor Orb effect on a creature. Because if it's a creature, I prefer to have ways to break the symmetry, I think, because creatures are inherently more fragile than artifacts or enchantments or even planeswalkers. So a simple lightning bolt would suffice to unlock, allowing your creatures to trigger their abilities again. So Strict Proctor giving players kind of an out to it is kind of cool in the same way that we've seen with like Lane and Arbiter, for example. So I don't know. I'm a fan of this kind of design mechanic, and I think there's some potential. Okay. So the next one that I had kind of identified as maybe there's some play, and I do want to clarify that most of the cards we'll be talking about are fringe play. They don't actually define archetypes or spawn their new cores to these decks. Rather, what they do is they open up more sideboarding and main decking options, and they remove some of the pressure of playing in a format like Legacy because they catch different things better than we've had hate cards do before. Like Strict Proctor is in many ways an upgrade to Tocatli Honor Guard, because Tocatli Honor Guard's body was just too trash to really justify to play, and Torpor Orb was kind of weak in certain decks. But yeah, let's go ahead and talk about Test of Talents, which is kind of cool against decks like maybe Sneak and Show, maybe some of the control decks in the format. I don't really think there's something that's like standout identifiable where you would want this over Surgical Extraction, but maybe it being a counterspell like has some extra value in the sideboard that you could play that can come in against Storm. It could come in against Control Mirrors, because oftentimes Control Mirrors, removing extra copies of a card actually ends up mattering in a lot of ways, because the games go on so long and it becomes a resource battle of attrition, where if you know that your opponent doesn't have any, say, Force of Wills left in their deck, or any negates, or anything of that nature, it allows you to gain edges in that way. Now, the big test for this card, so to say, is that we need to figure out whether or not it's worth playing over something like Flusterstorm or Negate, which are typically cards that are far more playable than this. And even Negate itself doesn't see play in a ton of decks, but it is something that does show up from time to time. Because 2 mana is a lot for something that is relatively narrow in its application. This can't counter a Jace the Mind Sculptor, it can't counter a Lion's Eye Diamond that your Storm player was sandbagging, like there's or they top decked. There's a lot of things that this cannot counter that may actually end up mattering, and I'm not sure that this actually has enough to see play. But if you really hate Sneak and Show, maybe this is a way to somewhat increase your win percentage against those decks. I think, generally speaking, if they're casting a show and tell and you're able to counter it, it probably doesn't matter that you remove all the other show and tells from their deck. But I could see that being really huge against like Omnitel, where all of their effective, cheating win cons are vulnerable to this card. And maybe a card like this gets a little bit better index to play Snapcaster Mage, right? Because you can end up doubling up on this over the course of the game. Even countering something like a Brainstorm, I think, may actually be relevant in some of the control mirrors. Stopping your opponent from selecting their cards is somewhat similar to preventing them from drawing cards. So but ultimately, I don't think this card is quite good enough, but I just wanted to talk a little bit about the fact that it does line up somewhat favorably in the same way that Surgical would against specific cards. But Surgical is obviously way more broad in its application, and it's a free spell. So a lot of times there's not a significant difference between going down a card to remove all copies of Dark Ritual from your opponent's deck, right? Like Force of Willing it, and then Surgicaling it is like pretty similar to just casting this, but it was 0 mana. So you are definitely paying a premium for the fact that you can kind of bundle both of those into one, but only against 2 specific card types. So I probably wouldn't put any into my deck, but I think it's a card that we haven't really seen before. So we've seen effects like this at like 4 mana or 5 mana. But nothing this particularly cheap. So I think it's worth considering. The next one that I'm going to talk about actually has some crossover with the prior one in terms of the decks it would play. It would, maybe your 4-color piles, your Grixis controls, maybe your Sultai, is Sedgemoor Witch, which, well, I think if Monastery Mentor has taught us, it's that, and Young Pyromancer as well, it's taught us that these types of effects are actually deceptively powerful in Legacy, and it doesn't really matter what type of token they generate. Yes, Monastery Sphere has prowess itself, and it generates tokens with prowess, but ultimately the most important thing is that it generates some form of token off of instants and sorceries, and there's clearly benefit, at least in prior Legacy eras, to playing Monastery Sphere because of things other than instants and sorceries. For example, when we had Sensei's Divining Top was legal, and you could do that loop over and over to generate that as a win con, and you can't do that here with Sedgemoor Witch, but it does also have the cast or copy component, so you can combine it with Chain of Smog to make an infinite amount of pest tokens. You could combine it with Flusterstorm, which a lot of these decks are playing some number of in the 75, and that actually gets you like maybe an extra token in the Flusterstorm flights. But Menace itself also is like a way to kind of give this card more board presence. So I think there's a lot of potential for this card in these blue-black X style control decks, whether they're 4-color, whether they're 3-color. I don't think it really matters. I think the most important takeaway is that it's pretty reasonable to play it in those decks to play a young pyromancer that has more board impact, because pyro itself not being able to really attack or block comes up. There's also no value you get from when they target it. And while some of these decks could just play Young Pyromancer, for example, many of the Grixis decks could just play Young Pyro if they were so inclined. I think playing a card like Sedgemoor Witch that has higher impact than Pyro, I think is more important for those kinds of decks. There's a reason we don't see, for example, the Grixis list on the screen. There's a reason this type of deck doesn't play Delver of Secrets, right? Because they're not trying to capitalize on the tempo that comes with mana efficient threats. They're looking at playing a lot of the so-called best in slot effects that they can get that to provide the most value over the course of the game, or provide the most value in a broad range of situations. Them being pest tokens over just generic vanilla tokens actually comes up in a good variety of matchups. And the menace itself actually allows you to pressure in board states that you otherwise wouldn't really be able to. So there's just like a lot going on that I think contributes to the playability of this card. Not to mention the fact you can get a reasonably easy infinite combo with it with Chain of Smog, which there is at least one other card on this list that we'll also be talking about with Chain of Smog that I'm sure many of you have seen in legacy discussions, and that actually Patrick, one of my friends, Patrick, in one of our legacy group chats, actually sent me a deck list as well that is trying to utilize the Chain of Smog plus Magecraft combos in various shells. One minor thing I wanted to touch up on with Sedgemoor Witch is the ward mechanic itself is something that I think is far more powerful in Legacy than it would be in other formats, except on this card. So in other formats, 3 life is a much higher percentage of your starting life total. And this is because in Legacy you don't have to pay life for shock lands and stuff or play as many tap lands. So your effective starting life total is higher in Legacy than it is in Modern or Pioneer, and that means then that paying 3 life, because less games are specifically about raw life total in Legacy than in other formats. Now, life total is a resource that you use very often in Legacy, no doubt, but the importance of 3 or 4 life is very different in Legacy than it is in other formats. In Modern, for example, a lot of the mid-range and control decks start at around 15 to 16 life, which is different than in Legacy, where they would start at around 18 to 17. So, pretty substantial difference there. And in Legacy in particular, because so much of the gameplay is focused on compressing the mana curve to 1, 2, and 3, rather than up to larger ranges of mana costs that we see in other formats, because it's a faster tempo based format, right? You get to draw from more cards, so obviously you're going to play more 1 and 2 drops, even in terms of card selection. And so what that means then is that the importance of making something cost 1 or 2 mana is much higher in that, or it's much more impactful in Legacy than it would be in Modern or Pioneer. Making me pay 2 mana extra for my removal spell could effectively mean I can't play my removal spell, whereas in a format like Pioneer, I could very well still just be able to play it. There are less things to do with that mana differential that would be there. So I think Sedgemoor Witch does lose a little bit of the value of the ward mechanic specifically for Legacy, simply because 3 life is for this type of effect is definitely weaker than 2 mana, so specifically in Legacy. But in something, and maybe Modern as well, but in Standard or Pioneer, it's actually probably better, the 3 life than the 2 mana. So, just because that's an avenue that becomes more important. And that's just one of the unique quirks with Legacy, I think, that makes it cool to evaluate cards from that perspective. Okay, so it's not a lands card. I don't remember if I actually made a deck for this, but Conspiracy Theorist was a card that had initially escaped my assumption of legacy playability, despite the fact that on the day it was spoiled, I had been testing a modern deck with it and hollow one in it, because it allows you to discard your hollow ones and then cast them again. And so I had completely missed the fact that we had Hollow One Arclight as a deck for a little bit in Legacy. And maybe there's some world in which Conspiracy Theorist is pretty cool with Hollow One again, but also it kind of lets you build your own Past in Flames when you combine it with Lion's Eye Diamond, right? Because you could use Lion's Eye Diamond then to actually cast a spell. And I think that's pretty fringe, generally speaking, but it's something to consider. In addition to the fact that conspiracy theorist is a bear that, on its own, does provide card advantage every turn. So, because in theory you can just pay the one, discard the card, draw a card, and then play the card that you were going to discard. Now you can't play lands this way, but if you were already going to play a cantrip or a removal spell, maybe that's something you can do. It doesn't constrain your timing either, and it doesn't actually care how the card got discarded. Um, so I think there's a world in which you play this in a Hollow One deck, even though it is 2 mana. Um, but I mostly just wanted to put it up because I think that's just a card that like was it's very clearly super fringe, and I don't think it's an effect that very many people thought about, was combining it with Hollow One. But maybe that's just enough to see someone 5-0 with a quirky Hollow One deck again, which would be nice to see. I did enjoy playing some matches with the deck, despite the fact that it was never really super good. But I think more unique effects tied to creatures, in my opinion, is generally better design-wise, because it means that there being a creature is inherently valuable in a way that being an artifact or being an enchantment is not, and it's also inherently riskier, right? Because Swords to Plowshares exists, or Lightning Bolt exists. So it means that you can push the boundaries of unique 1 and 2 mana effects. Like this would never this type of effect wouldn't really be very good if it was like for 3 or 4 mana, right? Like you would never ever consider playing that. And people, we are far from the eras in which Library of Lang is something that that we would consider playing. I think that's the name of the card, um, where you can discard cards to the top of your deck instead of your graveyard, and being able to play them is obviously much better than just putting them on top. And it also doesn't really care how the card was discarded either, as long as it was discarded. So if you have this in play and your opponent thought seizes you, and you're playing and you have like Brainstorm, Force of Will, Lightning Bolt, they can't really take anything, right? So because you can still cast it that turn. Now, you are still given the choice of putting it into your graveyard if you want to end up snapcasting it later instead of casting it that turn, but it is a way to somewhat mitigate the effects of other discard spells. I think one of the applications for it is something like Surgical Extraction, stuff like that, where oftentimes these decks where Surgical Extraction really hoses them are trying to clear the way for Surgical with a Cabal Therapy or a Thoughtseize or an Unmask before they do that, and that's not really an option if you have Conspiracy Theorist in play. Same with something like Force of Will. They can't actually take those cards from you on that turn that they're going off. They can take them from you and then pass the turn, but you get another turn to do those effects anyway. But especially with something like Surgical Extraction, where I guess you would just cast it on their discard spell if they pass the turn, because you're only going to get that one opportunity. But so in that way, there's definitely some fringe application for this card, but I just want to pair it with Hollow One, discard a Hollow One, and just feel totally okay that I discarded that. So that's kind of what I was looking at. The next card is definitely a meme card, and this was one that initially I had discounted as well before Patrick had convinced me to put this on the list, mostly because I had been goldfishing it in Pioneer to kind of see how consistent we could put a dragon into play on turn 3 or turn 4 with that format's card pool, which is definitely different than Legacy's card pool, but a lot of the enablers would be the same, like Cathartic Reunion and stuff like that, but there'd be no Faithless Looting. So in that format, we were approaching it by using multiple Cathartic Reunion type effects. draw 2, discard 2s, stuff like that. And it was pretty good at triggering it by turn 4. But we were also testing a version that played a bunch of 1 and 2 mana mill spells, where you could target yourself and set up the dragon's approach as well. And so I think in Legacy, it's actually significantly easier to put a dragon into play on turn 3 or turn 4. And part of the problem we had in testing in Pioneer, for example, was the dragons even just weren't good enough at shutting down the format. So putting in a Niv-Mizzet Perrin is fine, but there are plenty of matchups in that format that don't play any instants or sorceries, and you're kind of just staring at this 5/5, and you built your whole deck around putting it into play. But in Legacy, there are some matchups where they probably can't beat a Niv-Mizzet Perrin if it resolves. And there are other dragons too that end up being really good to put into play. And Legacy does broaden up the options a little bit as it opens up the potential for combo kills with Dragon's Approach. You could grab Swift Warkite, for example, and get a Phantasmal Image, copying Swift Warkite again, grabbing maybe a Glasspool Mimic, copying it again before grabbing like something else. And so you could potentially build similar to how the Gyruda decks had functioned, of you build your whole deck around filling up your graveyard just enough, cast your all-in combo card, and then try to win with a bunch of flyers in one turn. So Swift Warkite was something we had identified as potential for a combo win con with Dragon's Approach. But in terms of triggering Dragon's Approach, it's actually pretty reasonable, but I think the threshold we were working with was at minimum you wanted like 18 copies of it. Now, you didn't have to play as many copies of it as you typically needed to for something like Shadowborn Apostle, which almost your whole deck would need to be, because it's so mana efficient that you kind of need them in play, right? So you actually have to like have enough to be able to play and through removal spells. With Dragon's Approach, it doesn't really matter if you discard them or not. So you can spend your whole couple of opening turns on just putting as many into your graveyard as you can and churning through your deck. So being able to leverage the power of something like Careful Study or Faithless Looting is something that we've shown to be powerful throughout Legacy's history. So in that sense, if the format shifts into a way in which it is difficult for them to deal with any of these dragons, I think there's some viability to a Dragon's Approach deck. However, I wouldn't be particularly happy if that were the case, because the deck plays the exact same every game. Simply by the nature of this mechanic of having to include a ton of copies of this card. But maybe putting Niv-Mizzet Perrin into play is enough in Legacy. It seems pretty difficult for Delver to beat that if it resolves, whereas currently right now they're able to beat a reasonable amount of 3-drops that resolve. But the other thing that kind of stands in your way for something like Niv-Mizzet Perrin or some of the other dragons is Brazen Borrower is a card, and the decks and Swords to Plowshare is a card for some of the slower decks too. So if you're investing all of this into a dragon and they kind of just kill it, I mean, yeah, they may have put themselves down cards to kill it, particularly if it's Niv-Mizzet, but that may not matter because you kind of spent so many resources getting that dragon into play in the first place. But there are some combo kills you can do with that I think has some potential. And so this relatively innocuous card is something that I've definitely done some thinking about in Legacy in particular. But there's no world in which this will ever be a good like tier deck, right? Because Surgical Extraction fucking destroys it way too hard. Even your rudimentary counter magic interacts pretty favorably with Dragon's Approach deck, simply because you don't have the luxury of playing as many counter spells as you want, right, to protect the combo and stuff like that. Maybe you have to play a bunch of Veil of Summers instead, just because it requires so many deck building slots. Okay, Fervent Mastery is another card that is almost certainly bad, but I think one of the archetypes that this could see play in is something like Ruby Storm. Now, Ruby Storm typically wants to... It doesn't really care that much about searching its deck for specific cards versus just actually being able to play them off the top of its deck. But maybe triple gamble is enough for Fervent Mastery to work, because you can grab like a Past in Flames and something else, and if you've generated enough mana, you can get like deterministic kills with Fervent Mystery in a way that the deck hasn't really had before outside of Burning Wish. So there may be a world in which playing some amount of Fervent Mastery is correct in Ruby Storm, and it's also a deck that can arguably utilize the alternative cost of the Mastery cycle of cards the most, because so, letting your opponent discard cards and then draw that cards doesn't always matter if you're playing like a wheel effect. Like if you're there's a Ruby Storm version that plays Echo of Eons, and if you're playing that version, it doesn't really matter that much if you're doing this for the alternate cost, right? Because you're just going to grab Echo, LED, and like something else anyway, right? Or you can grab like 3 of the same card too. As well, which I guess you could also grab Hollow One if you wanted to pay 5 mana for some amount of Hollow Ones. But I think Ruby Storm is a deck where this immediately jumped out. We've seen decks like that play cards like Reforge the Soul before, and so I don't think it's unreasonable that they would play some amount of Fervent Mastery, because paying 5 mana to deterministically win the game with you only need like 3 leftover mana, something like that, when you cast this card, is something that I think is pretty cool. So Ruby Storm is immediately where I would consider playing this, but it may not even make the cut, because again, 5 mana even for that deck is a good amount. But that's kind of just something to think about. I had in recent games against Legacy, I had on Magic Online, I have played against Ruby Storm multiple times, so it's always at the forefront of my mind. So the next one that I wanted to talk about is Myla Crafty Companion, which at first glance, oh yeah, I have a Ruby Storm list here actually, but it doesn't have and none of these lists I don't think have any of the Strixhaven cards in them. They're just basically stock lists for this stuff. And I'm not really sure what you would cut from Ruby Storm to fit that type of card, but maybe there's a home for it. Maybe you can cut some number of Past in Flames, actually, because you're grabbing a Past in Flames, and you don't really care if you discard it. So, and there's like a 4 or 5 color pile. So yeah, so Myla Crafty Companion is something that, is somewhat similar to Leovold for something like Death and Taxes. Now, it doesn't restrict your opponent from drawing multiple cards, and it's definitely a worse Leovold. But being a worse Leovold does not mean that it's a bad card. And this type of effect is relatively powerful in Legacy. When they target a permanent of yours, you draw a card. It affects wastelands, it affects removal spells, and especially in a proactive deck, these effects tend to be a little bit better. So Leovold works because it forces the game to revolve around it, right? Your opponent can't draw extra cards, so most decks actually have to deal with your board right at that point, or they have to deal with the Leovold at some point. So Leovold's abilities actually feed into each other in a proactive manner. Myla doesn't really have that issue, because by the virtue of being a white card, it tends to be more in a more proactive color or color combination than Leovold anyway. Bug or Sultai is not the most proactive in Magic's history, so Leovold is inherently constricted by in the decks that it can be played in. And it's more powerful as a result, because it is a relatively restrictive cost, a multicolor card. And Myla is not super restrictive in its mana cost. You could play this in a couple different decks. You could play this in sideboard of more decks if you wanted. But this type of ability, I think, is something that's kind of a standout to me. The fact that it's on a creature that you can tutor out with Recruiter of the Guard. And that's just kind of my thoughts on this. Is I would expect D&T to play some number of this in the 75. It seems really good in the fair matchups, and it might even be pretty reasonable in the D&T mirrors, right? Like if they Flicker Wisp you, if they Jite your creatures, if they Skyclave Apparition your creatures, or Swords you, or even like Rashad and Porter Wasteland. All of those are going to draw a card, and also works on triggered abilities too. Not that there are very many right now, but it would work on like Skyclave is the one standout one. So I think I think this card is actually very playable, and I would be surprised if this card does not um, make like stock lists. Yeah, and it being legendary means you can bounce it with Caracas, right? So you can keep it around. And if they bounce it with their Caracas, you get to draw a card. I don't know why they bounce your 2/3, but it's something that can happen. Okay, Vanishing Verse is a card that I don't actually have a deck list for a card like this, and I don't really want to go as long on it as I have with these other cards, simply because it has a restrictive cost. But you know, 2 mana exiling a monocolored permanent. There's a reasonable amount of monocolored permanents right now in Legacy that are powerful, and there's a reasonable amount of multicolored ones that are powerful, like Uro and stuff like that. So yeah, it doesn't hit Strix, it doesn't hit Uro, but it hits Jace the Mind Sculptor, it hits Delver. There's like a good amount of threats that it actually hits, and there's not a ton of black-white X decks in Legacy, but maybe some form of Esper control variants ends up wanting access to this in the sideboard. I think that's basically the only place I think I would play it. Generally speaking, most decks that play creatures are going to have better removal in the form of Skyclave Apparition anyway. So I think it's mostly the like some form of Esper Snapcaster control deck might end up playing it. Yeah, no, I don't think I have anything for it. So Witherbloom Apprentice is actually one of the other cards I wanted to specifically dedicate time to, and this is one of the most hyped cards from Strixhaven for Legacy, because it combines with Chain of Smog. Now, you Chain of Smog, you target yourself, you copy it, you target yourself, and you repeat that over and over until you've triggered Magecraft as many times as you want and your opponent is dead. And one of the reasons that this combo has potential is because both of them cost 2 mana. They're relatively cheap, and Witherbloom Apprentice can be gotten with Green Sun Zenith or Summoner's Pact. So this, I believe, is the list that Patrick sent me, and it's kind of it's a Nick Fit deck that utilizes the Chain of Smog combo. Now, there's obviously numbers that I think I would change, and I believe that this list was made before we saw Sedgemoor Witch, which I would probably play like one of in a deck like this anyway. But you can see it utilizes Nick Fit as like a mana package to be able to combo with this in one turn, but you can also just search for the Witherbloom Apprentice, right? You have Green Sun Zenith to be able to do that. You can also like use Sylvan Libraries to help dig for it. And Nick Fit is actually a deck that is well suited to actually playing 6 mana cards. So something like Professor Onyx, which is another combo with Chain of Smog, is a lot more viable in a deck like this. And we know actually from looking at current Legacy that Green Sun Zenith decks are actually pretty powerful right now. In general, that you've got access to a bunch of sideboard hate cards in your main deck, in addition to proactive threats. But now you can grab a combo kill. I'm not sure how relevant that combo kill is, because Witherbloom Apprentice is pretty bad on its own in decks that are looking to play the Chain of Smog combo, because typically they don't play very many instants and sorceries, and most of the time they're not playing blue. A lot of the decks that are playing blue don't necessarily need to play a combo kill attached to their 2-drop in order to win the game. They can kind of just outvalue people because you can just find the best cards due to brainstorm and stuff like that. So I'm not really sure how viable Chain of Smog is as a card on its own, but Witherbloom not having to play as many copies of it because you can Green Sun Zenith for it maybe mitigates the fact that both of those cards are kind of bad on their own, because you can maybe get away with playing more copies of Chain of Smog than you can Witherbloom Apprentice, because you can just tutor for Witherbloom, or vice versa. If you had a way to tutor for Chain of Smog but not for Witherbloom Apprentice, then I would make the same argument as well. Especially because I think that, especially with Sedgemoor Witch, there are more ways to win with Chain of Smog than there are that actually and that function the same as Chain of Smog, right? So I think you definitely want like 3 to 4 copies of that. But this is just one of the shells that it can work in. And another shell I actually have is take on Spanish Inquisition, playing the Chain of Smog Witherbloom Apprentice combo. Now, also at the time that this list had been made, we also hadn't seen Sedgemoor Witch, and we hadn't seen some of the other cards that had been spoiled yet. And in particular, it definitely feels like it would be a less consistent version of an already very inconsistent deck, because you can't really cut too many of the mana enablers, so you have to start cutting card advantage things. But being able to win the game off just 4 mana is technically faster than Charbelcher, and it does mean that you don't get to play Lion's Eye Diamond, but I think that's probably fine in a lot of ways. You can mitigate that somewhat. Lion's Eye Diamond is mostly there to combo with Charbelcher, but also made Infernal Tutor a lot better. So if you don't play Lion's Eye Diamond, you can't really play Infernal Tutor particularly well in a deck like this, and there's less reason to play Lion's Eye Diamond if you're not playing Charbelcher. But if you're playing Witherbloom Apprentice plus Chain of Smog, that could be more than enough to compensate for not playing those 2 cards. It's actually like better in some opening hands too, because you can just tutor for Witherbloom if you need to off of Summoner's Pact. So that I think is something that's pretty cool. And I think there's going to be some amount of games where you just Chain of Smog your opponent as a him, and like they're going to copy to make you discard 2, and you just go back and forth, and you just like hope that you can get something. But it's very difficult to ever, in a deck like this, ever justify Chain of Smogging your opponent. But if you were to incorporate something like Past in Flames into it, I could see that as an option. But yeah, so I think most of the value of Chain of Smog is just as a combo kill. But it's a card that you don't mind. You don't mind pitching it to Chrome Mox in a lot of hands either. And I think that's something that's actually pretty crucial. And I think being able to Summoner's Pact for half of a combo is something we haven't really seen a deck like this have access to before, even though it is a little bit all in. All right, so the next one, and this is actually the second to last that I have prepared, but it's the last one that I have graphics of. This is actually not from Strixhaven set. It's from the Commander that releases at the same time as Strixhaven. The Strixhaven Commander 2021 is Strixhaven themed, and I've talked a little bit about Word before on Sedgemoor Witch, but here it effectively says this creature is hexproof, right? And I had first tried incorporating Octavia into maybe some kind of Delver deck because we've seen Bedlam Reveler be playable before, but you can't quite play it the same way that you would play Bedlam Reveler because you actually have to hit 8 cards. So it actually punishes you for playing things like Gurmag Angler. It punishes you a lot harder than Bedlam Reveler punishes you, because Bedlam Reveler, you don't feel that bad in a lot of games just playing it for 3 to 5 mana, depending on how long the game is going, because that's what that card is designed for. This, you don't have that option. It's a binary state. Either it costs 2 mana or it costs 10 mana, which is uncastable. So in that sense, I kind of wanted to look at shells that would be incentivized to put a lot of instant sorceries in the graveyard that also can capitalize on having multiple 8/8s in play. Because when it's in play, whenever you Magecraft, you also turn something into an 8/8. So I started looking at Delver decks, and I was like, well, you can't really just slot this into Delver. You kind of need to build around it. So maybe we put it in a Faithful Suiting deck. And that's kind of where I had thought that maybe you put it in some kind of Arclight shell, because Arclight itself can kind of function as a Delver of Secrets anyway, and turning an Arclight into an 8/8, it does give you an 8/8 flyer. So if you put an Arclight into play and then you Octavia on the next turn, that's actually pretty reasonable. So I had kind of like put together a rough Arclight shell. It's possible that you don't play Delver, or it's possible that you don't play Young Pyromancer, and maybe instead you play like, I think you probably want main deck Surgicals in a deck like this for sure. Maybe you play some number of Thought Scour, But Surgical Extraction is a free spell to trigger Pyromancer, Arclight, and Octavia, but it also gives you a way to have some game one against some of the combo decks in the format. But you get to use Brainstorm, Careful Study, and Fatal Looting to kind of find Arclights relatively quickly, or just put enough instant sorceries into your graveyard. I may have missed a particular instant or sorcery that's really good on turn 1 or 2 in this type of deck. I did include the 4-mana Morphos, and it's likely you don't actually need 4, but I've included them nonetheless. You could have some number of Once Upon a Time, to be honest. This could be a teamer deck. You just play like 4 Once Upon a Times, and then you end up being able to trim maybe Delver of Secrets, because Delver of Secrets kind of shoehorns you into playing more tempo-based counter magic, which is kind of awkward with Arclight Phoenix and Octavia, because you kind of want the ability to proactively play your stuff. So if you end up being able to cut Delver of Secrets and maybe you play something like Young Pyromancer instead, then you can trim maybe Force of Negation, or you can trim Daze, or you can trim some number of the interactive spells, and you can play more engine pieces and maybe like more surgical extractions and stuff like that. So I'm not really sure how you would go about building it exactly, but this was kind of my first attempt at it. And I think if you can play Octavia on turn 3, that's obviously like pretty good, right? If you have 8 instant sorceries in your graveyard, and I'm not sure what the best way to do that is, other than Careful Studies and Faithless Lootings. But a lot of times, Delver decks don't even play True Name Nemesis on turn 3, right? They wait until turn 4, turn 5, when you have the ability to play True Name and do something else on the same turn. Um, and one of the advantages of sticking to blue-red is you actually get to hit higher land counts because you're stronger against Wasteland. So especially if you play a card like Manamorphose. So I'm not really sure if this is really a particularly good build for this kind of card, but I think cards like this tend to have some amount of people trying them out when they first hit Legacy. So I would expect to see some amount of Octavia, just because 8/8 hexproof for 2 is obviously much better than something like Gurmag, but the advantage of Gurmag is it's far easier to cast it for 1 or 2 mana than it is Octavia. And also, Octavia is pretty weak to Baleful Strix, not going to lie, or Icefang Coatl. So you do need some way to get around that, and that was maybe why I was thinking like you could pair it with Pyromancer, or Arclight Phoenix, because you can kind of spread a bunch of 8/8s around. You can actually wait until blockers, and then turn one of your tokens into an 8/8. The other card I wanted to talk about, I don't think I have a deck list for it either, was yesterday one of the last cards that was spoiled for the Strixhaven Commander decks. Sorry about the lighting. My lights went off for right now, but I'll have... evidently, I'm not just going to sit here in the dark all night, but the video is almost over, so I'm just going to turbo it out. There was... I forget the name of the card, but it was like a 9 mana... I want to say it was like a 7 mana or a 9 mana, like 7/6 with trample. If you've gained life, you can cast it out of your graveyard, and it costs 1 less for each life you've gained this turn. The main reason I wanted to talk a little bit about that card is because I've worked a lot on building different veto lists. The thorn, whatever the creature, when you gain life and the opponent loses that much life on the creature, it gives your creature's life link, whatever. So I've built decks around Urborg and Refreshing Rain, and that's actually something that I looked at again with this type of card, especially because in, I believe it was Kaldheim, they gave us an Angel where if you have 7 more life than your starting life total, all your creatures get +2/+2, and it's a 3 mana 2/4 with flying anyway. So, that can also just be like another reasonable payoff for like the Refreshing Rain Urborg engine, and decks like that really suffer from a redundancy problem. So having more big, beefy, stompy creatures that reward you for putting bad cards like Weather the Storm, Life Goes On, or Refreshing Rain into your deck, I think is pretty cool. And it also gives you a more budget way to kind of play silly decks in Legacy. And by adding more redundancy to those decks, you can afford to play more conventional disruption like Thoughtseize and Thalias and stuff like that in your sideboard. And you can kind of be a different flavor of of creature deck in Legacy. And especially with all the new creatures that they've been giving us that can provide disruption, I just think it's really cool that we are able to combine a lot of these synergies, even though they'll never be like tier 1 or tier 2. I think in particular the Refreshing Rain Urborg one is just kind of cute, you know? Um, but if all of a sudden you can actually use that to make powerful, flashy plays, that I think is really cool. And it's in ways that are actually relatively tame compared to what Legacy's doing, right? Like a 3 mana 4/6 flyer is great, right? But when you have to do those effects to do it, it's still good, but it's not like putting a Grizzlebrand into play, right? Or putting an Emrakul into play and attacking with it, or just casting it and killing your opponent. So it's definitely combo-esque in that way, but it's definitely rooted in being able to play more of a fair plan, because you can also just like put big creatures into play on turn 2 or turn 3 and hope that's good enough. So I think I think Strixhaven adds a lot of slight tweaks to the way that we would approach deck building in Legacy, even though I don't think there's very many like clear, standout, great Legacy cards for it, which I think is a personally healthy spot to be in. I know a lot of people, what they like about Legacy is the format doesn't change the way other formats change, though that's not really been the case the last couple of years with the ridiculously pushed power level of Modern Horizons and Throne of Eldraine. It's really, really, really changed like the landscape of playability in Legacy. So I think it's nice when we get a set that kind of preserves the metagame of Legacy, but challenges you with deck building questions. And I think Strixhaven does that very well. So